Hi everyone. So this video was very unplanned. I actually planned to upload something else on the channel, but a few days ago a friend of mine sent me a video by Kings and Generals where they made a claim that I really disagree with, and I decided to make this video and kind of respond to that claim. Now the video in question is about the Kievan Rus, and it's actually a very long video. It's over 2 hours long. And the topic of the Kievan Rus is not really, it's a little bit out of my area of expertise, but around the 49-minute mark, they said this. Let's listen.
The Danubian Bulgars had converted to Greek Orthodox Christianity in 864, but didn't want to become too culturally dependent on their longtime Byzantine rivals. As a result, they welcomed the disciples of Cyril and Methodius into their lands, adopting the Slavonic church tongue over Byzantine Greek as the official language of their people, which is one of the reasons why arguably Turkic Bulgarians speak a Slavic tongue today.
Now this is a huge oversimplification of why the Cyrillic alphabet was created, but I do understand oversimplifying facts with the interest of time. That is something that I do in my own documentaries as well. If I talk about a subject that is not directly related to the topic of the video, I'm going to oversimplify it, so that is perfectly understandable. However, it was this claim in particular that I took issue with.
Adopting the Slavonic church tongue over Byzantine Greek as the official language of their people, which is one of the reasons why arguably Turkic Bulgarians speak a Slavic tongue today.
So, Kings and Generals made the claim that Bulgarians are arguably Turkic. In their words, that's a quote. Before I address this claim, I want to open a couple of caveats. Firstly, I'm Bulgarian, so take that for what you will. Over the years, I have actually somewhat debated this issue with people from other countries, and the response that I usually get is something along the lines of, oh, you disagree with this notion because it's a matter of national pride. You come from a very biased point of view, and they reject my arguments based on that, which is kind of ironic because they reject my claims because I am Bulgarian, and they claim that I have this bias because I am Bulgarian, yet they're biased against me because I make these claims and I'm Bulgarian. So that's kind of ironic. The second point that I wanted to make before addressing the claim is that I'm not really a fan of Kings and Generals, and I have implied this in a previous video of mine. Now, I do believe that they do make some incorrect claims on purpose with some ill intent behind it. But the reason why I believe that, I'm gonna keep this to myself, and in this video I am only going to respond to this claim in particular. I'm not going to talk about Kings and Generals. Now, the only point that I want to make about Kings and Generals that is not going to be a knock on them, but rather a point that personally interests me, is that I really don't understand why Kings and Generals in particular would make this claim. To my understanding, Kings and Generals actually employ Bulgarians within their writing team. I have met someone online who claimed to have been a writer for Kings and Generals. And given that pretty much no Bulgarians believe in this notion that Bulgarians are Turkic, it is really bizarre to me why they would make such a claim. Okay, now let's get to the actual claim. So, are modern Bulgarians in any way Turkic? So once again, over the years, I have heard many people incorrectly claim that Bulgarians are in some way Turkic, and I guess a good place to start is where this comes from. So this notion that Bulgarians are in some way Turkic comes from a theory about the origin of the Proto-Bulgarians. Let me elaborate first on the term Proto-Bulgarians. So the Proto-Bulgarians, or the Bulgars, are the people who established the first Bulgarian state during the Middle Ages. Now, I personally prefer the term Proto-Bulgarians as opposed to Bulgars, and that is for two reasons. Firstly, is because in Bulgarian, we don't actually have a word for Bulgar. We just call the Bulgars, we just call them Proto-Bulgarians. That's literally what the word that we use translates to. And secondly, I don't like this term because, I mean, it's kind of made up, and it's made in a way to sound Turkic, and once again I disagree with this notion. The only context in which I would use the term Bulgar would be if I wanted to refer to the Volga Bulgars. In that case, I think the term is useful. However, this Turkic theory for the origin of the Proto-Bulgarians basically states that the people who founded the first Bulgarian state came somewhere from Central Asia. They were these semi-nomadic Turkic people who migrated, fleeing from the Huns. They crossed the border, they crossed the Danube, they crossed the borders of the Byzantine Empire. They were eventually hired as mercenaries and given land by the Byzantines, which they would rule independently. And of course, that's a summary of the whole theory. However, something important that I wanted to mention about this theory is that even if you believe that this theory about the Proto-Bulgarians is true, you would still have no reason to think that modern Bulgarians are in some way Turkic. Why is this? Well, because the theory states that these Bulgars or Proto-Bulgarians that were of Turkic origin, well, they were just a ruling elite. They were a small minority, and they eventually intermixed with the Slavic population. They adopted Slavic culture, they adopted the Slavic language, so essentially they had little to no influence on the genetics of modern Bulgarians. This is why no sane anthropologist would agree or even consider this notion that Bulgarians are arguably Turkic, as kings and generals claim. There is nothing Turkic about Bulgarian culture. Bulgarian is a Slavic language, and Bulgarian traditions and Bulgarian culture is very similar to other Southeastern European Slavic cultures. So it's not like there's some kind of a mystery how this nation that was founded by a bunch of Turkic people ended up being Slavic, as once again kings and generals kind of imply in their video. So that's my first point. Even if you believe in this theory that the Proto-Bulgarians were Turkic, there's still no reason to believe that modern Bulgarians are Turkic. Now let's get into why I personally do not believe in this theory myself. Well, it's an outdated theory. It's essentially the first theory about the Proto-Bulgarians and their origin, and it was created decades ago. Since then, historians have actually done a lot more research, made a lot more discoveries, and polished their theories to fit reality better. Now, personally, I don't really argue this theory with non-Bulgarian speakers anymore because it's kind of futile. And the reason for this is that essentially most, if not all of the sources on the updated theories that modern Bulgarian historians agree with and believe in, well, basically all of them are in Bulgarian. None of them that I know of have been translated into English, which is why non-Bulgarian speakers have not really had access to this kind of information. And to give an example of such a source, probably the most famous book which talks about the more modern views on Proto-Bulgarians is this book, which I'm going to show on the screen right now, and it's called Bulgar: The Secrets of Our Origin. And despite the somewhat clickbait title of it, it's written by an actual historian. Now, personally, I don't have this huge argument from authority bias that I wouldn't really consider a source unless it was written by someone who was formally educated. But for those people, the book is not written by a nobody, it's written by an actual historian. The book also has two parts. Unfortunately, I have only read the first part of the book, but it's pretty comprehensive. Of course, there are some books which are not as high profile, I guess, but there are other sources, and I believe that overall, most Bulgarian historians disagree with the Turkic theory. Now, I just showed this book to give you an example of a source in Bulgarian which talks about this issue in depth. However, I have actually managed to dig up some sources in English that I can show you, and once again, for all the people who only consider sources that are super academic and that are studies and written by actual formally educated people, those are actual peer-reviewed studies. So let's get into it. Of course, history is not an exact science like chemistry or biology or physics. So in that sense, a study is not as relevant as it would be if we were talking about physics or biology or chemistry. However, given the topic that I'm discussing today and the fact that it has to do with genetics and therefore biology, a study is actually a great way to demonstrate my point. So I'm not an expert on genetics, and I'm not going to pretend that I can just read the study and explain everything to you. However, I'm going to read the most relevant part of the conclusion, which I think demonstrates my point pretty well. But if you want to read the whole study, I'm going to leave a link in the description to it so you can access it and read it for yourself. The study says the following. We found that a major part of the Bulgarian Y chromosome gene pool is constituted by Western Eurasian haplogroups with a particular affinity to neighboring groups from the Balkans and Greece, in agreement with previous anthropological and mtDNA studies. When analyzed in a broader context, the Bulgarian haplogroup profile is located among European populations and apart from Altaic and Central Asian Turkic-speaking populations. Again, if you want to read the whole study, you can find a link to it in the description. But again, the Turkic theory states that these Turkic Proto-Bulgarians were just a very small minority of the population. So it would make sense that they would leave no genetic impact on the modern population. So in a sense, the study is not really in conflict with this theory. So we've examined modern Bulgarians and we pretty much know what their genome looks like. But what about these Proto-Bulgarians? Have we been able to extract their DNA? But before I get into that, I actually wanted to present something to you which actually looks really convincing at first glance. But then once you examine it, you kind of realize how bullshit it is. I thought it's interesting to present this evidence to you as well and kind of talk about it a little bit. So there have actually been several forensic facial reconstructions of Proto-Bulgarian skulls. And let me show you what they look like. So let's examine them a little bit. You can clearly see the East Asian characteristics, right? So this is really convincing. If this is actually what they look like, then, well, yeah, I mean, it's undeniable that they do have some Turkic facial characteristics, right? Yeah, the only problem with that is that forensic facial reconstruction is way more art than science. For example, and this is my favorite example to show. So a few years ago, there was this huge controversy about the forensic facial reconstruction of the so-called British Cheddar Man. The end result of the facial reconstruction looked like this. I believe that there was quite a bit of artistic interpretation put into this facial reconstruction. But whether you agree with me or not on this particular point, this is an earlier reconstruction of the exact same skull. Now, again, let's ignore the really obvious here, but aside from that, do they look anything alike? How are they a reconstruction of the same skull when they look completely different? I don't know, is it just me? Am I not seeing the similarities, or do they look literally completely different? But anyway, this proves my point that with forensic facial reconstruction, you have a lot of liberty for interpretation. And I believe that if you give the same skull to two different artists who do this kind of thing, the two end results are going to look very, very different. Okay, but that was just a little bit of a side tangent. That was just a point that I personally find interesting. But what about genetics? Have we been actually able to examine the genetics of these Proto-Bulgarians? Well, in fact, we have. And the best thing about it is that there is actually a study in English, which I'm going to be able to present to you. So once again, not an expert on genetics. I'm not going to pretend like I can read the whole study and explain it to you. But again, if you want to do that, you can find the link to it in the description. However, once again, I'm going to read the conclusion of the scientists who conducted the study, and you can make your own conclusion based on that. So let's read it. In the conclusion of the study, we can read the following. The work on ancient Bulgarian samples adds to the genetic picture of the past by presenting the first data on ancient mtDNA samples from individuals who inhabited the current Bulgarian territories from the 8th to the 10th century AD. Our results show that the haplogroups found in ancient samples are predominantly Western Eurasian. This finding supports the concept for the Western Eurasian matrilineal origin of the Proto-Bulgarians and conflicts with the Mongolo-Altaic and Hun-Tataric theories. Comparison of Proto-Bulgarians in modern Eurasian populations, including those from the Volga-Ural region, shows that despite the time gap of more than 11 centuries, there is genetic similarities between Proto and modern Bulgarians. So there you have it, a study which conflicts with the Turkic theory for the origin of the Proto-Bulgarians. Add this to the ton of information that we have in Bulgarian regarding this issue, and I'm pretty convinced. Let me know what you think. Did I convince you? Was this not convincing enough? Do you want me to present more evidence? In the future, I do plan on making a full-on documentary about the subject, but this is a project that would take a monumental amount of effort. In order for me to do this and be really extensive and detailed in my analysis and present the information in full, it would take me months, if not years, to be able to create such a documentary. So that is a project that I've definitely thought about for a long time, but it is not something that is on my radar right now, just because of the sheer amount of effort that it would take. However, I am interested in the topic, and I might talk about it more in the future. I'm also considering doing more of these YouTube style videos where I sit and talk in front of a camera making some kind of a response or something like that, because I kind of enjoy it, and because I believe that it is content that is more suitable for YouTube than my usual very heavily edited documentaries that take a very long time to complete. So yeah, maybe I'll be doing more of this in the future. Anyway, again, let me know what you think. Any kind of comments are appreciated. If you liked the video, like it. If you disliked it, that's also an option. And yeah, that's gonna be it from me for now, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.